All right, looks like we're getting back towards a quorum. Let's give people just maybe one more minute, and then we'll get things rolling. And for those that were having some internet issues, I just put in the chat, if you can hear me, that I did set up a live stream to YouTube, and so it's delayed by a little bit. Oh, and now I'm talking to myself. It's delayed, I think, by 30 seconds or something, but it's at least something that you can watch the presentation part if you on a phone if you get stuck. Okay, then give me one moment and then we'll get rolling. All righty, looks like we got about, looks like we're at quorum. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hope everyone had a good lunch. And as we, I should also mention that we are recording this entire everything. And so we will be able to share that link after the fact if that's useful, because I know some people had asked. Weather not being great affects internet. That's something I haven't messed with before. I'm not sure if you guys have satellite internet. That's interesting. Anyways, the way we're going to spend this afternoon is we're going to do a very short instructional piece on kind of the next steps of planning. And after that, we'll just break back into work time. And so we talked about context and we talked about learning outcomes. Now we're going to build in a few more of these elements. So starting with, oh, excuse me. Let me make sure this is actually sharing properly. Sorry about that. There we go. Cool. Okay, so one thing to start off with is that we're going to, at this point, start thinking about the duration of project. There are all sorts of different scales of projects, from something that's a few days long, sometimes maybe even a day or two, all the way into the multi-month projects. And there are pros and cons to each, and it's going to be different for every kind of project. But I will just say that in the beginning, I highly recommend starting with something that's a few weeks. Let's say kind of averaging around that 2-week point, because that gives you time to kind of do something, make mistakes like we always do, and then kind of reflect and try again. Because if you go straight into a very ambitious project, sometimes it can start going in the wrong direction and just become overwhelming. And I would hate for that to, put someone off to PBL at large when it's just like anything, we learn as we go. And so I know that sometimes people see like, big sexy projects and they think like that's PBL, but it doesn't have to be. And so I want to show a few quick examples on how you can do relatively small projects structurally, but that, oh, I'm hearing that there is some issues with the share screen. So I'm going to unshare and share again, just to make sure if it's not getting full screen. So I'm going to unshare.
If there are no 4 arrows, you can also try closing the chat and then reopening the chat, because sometimes it takes closing the chat to get the share screen to go onto the big screen.
Perfect. And then Yvonne and I can both turn our video off too, which will give you a little more room. So hopefully that's better. Cool. So for big themes and small projects, you can have these kind of expansive contexts and these very large ambitions, but still do a project that is quite small. And the examples here, up top left, is a project we did in just about a week and a half, where with a group of students, this was kind of an elective, we built radio-controlled aircraft from scratch and kind of flew them around and learned a little bit about engineering. And that specific project did not have some great learning ambition. The entire point of that project in that week and a half, in that elective, was to develop confidence and to kind of bring people into the kind of engineering curriculum in a safer way that wasn't quite as scary. And so, like, there were targets, of course, but that wasn't necessarily an academic learning target, and it was a very quick thing. On the right, it shows a project called Makeshift Poetry. And so this was a project that was relatively small, took just a few weeks. This was a collaboration between a humanities class and a physics and engineering class. And we basically wrote poems and made cute little mechanisms about the poems. And yes, they learned a little bit about poetry and engineering, but for that project, which was only about a week and a half, that was done the very first 2 weeks of school for a 9th grade group. And the goal there was, yeah, we can, get them learning a little bit, but we're also building fundamental skills for upcoming projects. We're assessing where that group is, because as you all know, like, every group is totally different. And so we've gotten overly ambitious before with a group that was not as capable. And so, this gives us a little preview. And so I have some of those other ideas there. It let us kind of test an idea and a process for another project in a safe space where if we completely screwed it up, it wasn't that big of a deal. It also let us start establishing our norms of a classroom. So everything from how to come in quickly and turn on your computer without eating the whole class period, to how we do feedback and critique, to the kind of language we use in the classroom, all those things that you might normally do with reading the syllabus, right? We kind of like work into this project. And so again, there were some academic targets for that little one there, but it had a ton of other outcomes that were super important to us that we use it for. So just as you're developing all these projects, I want you to just be thinking, about all these other intangible outcomes, which can be targets, but also about being comfortable going small and planning something that is maybe connected to a large theme like food security or global warming, but the actual project is only going to take a week or two. It's a good place to start, and it's also less scary to start. So with that caveat, going into these other elements of planning. You've so far done your learning outcomes in your context, and don't think that those are now set in stone, right? You might revisit those through this afternoon. That's totally okay. But we're going to talk now about focusing questions. And so a focusing question, there's two different kinds, is something that we can use to keep ourselves on track, and that also students can use to kind of guide themselves when there's a lot of choice. And so there's two kinds of questions that we like to use. One is a driving question, and we'll talk about what these are, and the other is an essential question. So I'll start with the slightly easier one, which is an essential question. And these are very big questions that tend to be kind of abstract and theoretical and something we aspire to. And it's something that we can often use to attack more less concrete topics like philosophy, for example. But some examples of an essential question that we could use to focus our project is, what is love, right? Like, are we going to tie that into math? I don't know, probably not. But can we tie that into some other things about philosophy and writing and history? Probably. When is war justified? Is nature or nurture more powerful? These don't have concrete answers, and that's okay. And so these can be used as an essential question to kind of guide a project if you want to kind of go in an open-ended direction. And so this is one place you can start. And some people will go a different direction with essential questions and make them very provocative. And it can be, I was talking with one group about how you can like kind of provoke students into caring by establishing things they want to argue against. And so maybe this could be that, I mean, I would never use this in a classroom, this example, but like the baby boomers were the best and most productive generation, right? If that's your essential question, like, were they the most essential, or were they the most productive generation, right? Like, any generation is going to want to argue that. So maybe that's a good thing to get students moving. You could decide. But these essential questions are just that good kind of abstract push. In contrast, a driving question, which I often see more of, and it's really one or the other, are much more concrete. And these are like the bumpers on the side of our project that kind of keep us honest. Because I've heard a few people mention student choice. One thing that can happen in projects, and often does, is that we give students choice because we're trying to be, good, engaging teachers. But then they get excited, so we give them a little more choice, and then a little more choice, and before we know it, they're off on a tangent that has nothing to do with our learning outcomes. And they're happy as can be, but we're not accomplishing what we set out to do. And so these driving questions can really help steer that. But again, they have concrete answers probably, but not necessarily a clear right or wrong one. So I'm going to revisit what a couple examples of this could be. And they also often are going to require more than knowledge. So someone earlier, when talking about dessert versus main course, mentioned that a main course project requires some kind of synthesis. And so a driving question will often require some kind of synthesis, and it will result in something novel, meaning not all answers will be the same, not all student tangibles will be the same. So let's look at one last list of requirements, which is basically just keeping them open-ended, Googleable, roll off the tongue, kind of cute, right? And this is all in your handout, so sorry if I'm going fast through these. So a question would be, what are key principles of investment? What do financial advisors do? A question like this has a very concrete answer. It is very Googleable. It is Wikipedia-able. And so this is more a word problem. This is not a driving question. A way to turn that into a driving question would be taking that and turning it to, how can we, as financial advisors, maximize profit for our clients? So we took something that had a Googleable answer, and we turned it into something that has a role, right? We're now financial advisors. We have a little bit of a context there. And we're trying to maximize profit, and there could be a lot of different schools of thought about how to do that, right? Probably going to have a discussion about it, and that kind of gives us a hint that that's a good example of a driving question. So we'll give a couple of these transition examples. How do forensic scientists solve crime? You could argue, like, if this is one or the other, if this is a good driving question or a bad driving question. I would say it's still a little bit on the Googleable side, right? We can look up a C-SPAN episode on, forensic scientists and kind of be done with it. It doesn't provoke me at all. Versus, how can we crack a cold case file, or even a specific cold case file? Or an alternative would be, is it possible as criminals to plan and execute the perfect crime? Now, if we compare these to the original, the content's the same. We could teach the same content, we could reach the same objectives, but the prompt is very, very different. And then our job as the kind of facilitator of these projects is that when we're going through, we try to keep everything we're doing honest to these driving questions. And so when students come to us and say, like, why am I doing this? This part isn't interesting. Why do I need to do a fourth draft? It's not, the answer is no longer to get the grade or because I said so. It's because the case file is still cold and we haven't cracked it yet. Or because you haven't shown me that a perfect crime is possible or not possible. It's just a way to kind of push them in the direction we want to go and to keep ourselves honest to the project. One more. So this is something that, like, at least I saw in school all the time, right? This is like the top of the syllabus, right? What are rhetorical devices and logical fallacies? Something we could all imagine seeing in high school or even a university course. But then we can then switch that into, how can I influence stakeholders in the Dallas teen tragedy? So that's a pretty big transition there. We still would be talking about elements of persuasion. We could still talk about rhetorical devices. We could still talk about taking a position on the issue. But hey, we just wrapped it around a very an engaging context, being something that, at least at the time we made this, was in the news and very relevant. And then we also made ourselves active in it. So we said, hey, there's this thing going on. How can we kind of leverage that as educators and make students feel empowered to be involved in it? Even if that is something we do internally, it gives just an authentic context and a guide for everything. And so again, when then students are like, I don't want to write this paper again, you're like, something really bad happened, and that we're not imagining this. We're not writing a paper just because. We're writing something or doing something because it might actually change somebody's life. And so again, a way we can kind of guide those questions. So before I move on to the next one, any questions, thoughts, comments on those two different kinds of questions? And while I'm giving people a sec to write in the chat, this will be one of those things on your deliverable at the end of the day where you have either an essential question or a driving question for your project, one or the other. Every once in a while, it might make sense to do both, but that's too much work. Okay, chat is silent now. Everyone's in a food coma. No questions? Okay, we'll keep going. So after we then do these kind of focusing questions, right, which we might wordsmith a little bit, but that's normally not a big part of this afternoon's work, is tangible outcomes. And so this is something that's very, very near and dear to my heart. We've talked about a structural part of project-based learning is that there is some kind of tangible outcome. Now, one of the fallacies is that that has to be a flashy, desserty thing. So like, I know I showed that like cool project we did with the wheel, but in many ways, like that flashy product also distracts from process. And so a tangible outcome can be a lot of different things. And it can be things like, and again, this is in your handout, it can be things like a physical like thing students make or develop. It can be a performance. It can be an act of service. It can be a presentation. All those kinds of things that we think of as a product or tangible outcome. And so I like to think if someone somewhere in the world gets paid to produce it or to do it, it's probably a tangible outcome. And you always want to steer these as much towards authenticity as you can. So obviously, you're not going to necessarily be building a bridge in an engineering class, like across a river necessarily, but you want to try and simulate or something as best you can, or just find something that you can actually do a kind of real world equivalent. And I tend to really push people to try and generate something that is roughly equivalent to professional work. And so if you are a writing teacher and a professional writer submits a manuscript in a particular way, that's probably how students should be submitting their manuscripts. If you are a math teacher and you want students to really understand how to write, contribute a math research to a publication, and there's a format for it, students should use the real format. And so we really want to try and remove the training wheels as much as possible here, and then scaffold like crazy, but to try and generate these tangible outcomes. And I will say the caveat is that, you know, posters, just a simple presentation, those tend to be kind of go-to tangible outcomes. And while they are not themselves bad, they just tend to be a little overused. And so I try to push people away from those a little bit. And the thing yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when it comes to presentations, like Scott said, I would steer you to think critically about how you're going to use a presentation if you are. And if you are going to use a presentation, and like have students do things like, you know, PowerPoints or posters that are pretty surface level. Usually what I use as a criteria for a presentation to be a good tangible outcome is that the presentation needs to have an authentic audience that's more than just your class. And so that's sort of a way to evaluate whether or not your presentation is enough to be, you know, a solid tangible outcome.
That is spot on. That is absolutely amazing feedback. Okay, so while we're in here too in this tangible outcome space, I like to, I have trouble articulating it sometimes, but the thing I'm always thinking about is the perfect tangible outcome, right? We aspire to this. It doesn't always work out, but the perfect tangible outcome, just by its completion, is evidence of all the learning outcomes. So I'm going to say that again. The perfect tangible outcome, just by completing it, shows that a student has mastery of all the outcomes that you want them to have. So that's not always as simple, as easy to do as it is to say, but that is a guide we can kind of keep in mind. And so if you're thinking about something that is a learning outcome that's important to you, one way to think of a tangible outcome is to say, what is it that this mastery would allow a student to do? And then how can I build that in as a tangible outcome? And this will help with brainstorming. Sometimes there's a lot of Googling to find out what these are, but I'm a huge fan of like figuring out awesome tangible outcomes and scaffolding them. So we can talk about that as we go. Any questions about tangible outcomes? So quiet on the chat. You guys were so active this morning. For all I know, my internet went out 20 minutes ago and I've just been talking to space. Okay, there, good. So this last one I'll go into just real quickly is number 5, which is adult world connections. So going exactly to what Yvonne said is we want to, as much as possible, have a connection to the outside world, the real world, the adult world. And there are a lot of different ways to do this that vary in complexity, but we want to figure out like how can we bring this additional layer of authenticity. And so sometimes that is, like Yvonne said, bringing an authentic audience. And so if you're doing a presentation, right, do that presentation for the school board, or bring in a bunch of expert architects to be your audience. Or we did a project once where it's called Seniors Squared, where seniors in high school had relationships and mentorships with senior citizens, right? And so like an adult world connection is a connection to what you're doing outside of the classroom. At its very simplest, it's a guest speaker. At its very best, it is a completely engaged audience that your project is going to physically and tangibly help. You're creating something for them that they will use in real life. And so there are some examples here. And if it's helpful, once people get started, I can talk through lots and lots of examples of how to bring in experts. But I will say that this also, as a teacher, takes legwork. And so as you know, it's sometimes hard to get people to come in, and maybe Zoom has made that easier. But I also, just as a matter of kind of habit, tend to pre-interview. Even if someone says, you know, oh, hey, I'm blah blah's dad, and I want to come in and speak. I'm an expert in blank. I will almost always have an introductory call and or meet them for lunch, buy them coffee, something. Because A, it forms a relationship and they're less likely to flake on you, which has probably happened to everyone. And then it also lets you just preview, because I've had a few experiences where people come in and do things like someone that I even pre-interviewed and I didn't catch anything, came in and wouldn't call on any female students. And so they got asked to leave halfway through their presentation. And there's just always those things, we're with kids, we want to make sure that we're modeling good things. And this is also a great time to bring in people that break molds. And so if you're bringing in a computer scientist, don't bring in a white dude with glasses, right? If you're bringing in an artist, bring in someone that's wearing a business suit, right? It's just a really good place to mix up expectations. And of all the things I've ever heard students reflect on, I've taught long enough now that I have students finishing college that, get in touch and tell me things they remember. The things they mention most are people that came in to speak and people they worked with that had nothing to do with the classroom. The one person they saw that they could relate to for whatever reason that represented something that they didn't think they could be. And so this adult world connection part is so important, and it's worth the little bit of extra work it takes. Okay, so we've and this has a few examples of how to do that. So we've now gone through the different steps. This morning we did step 1 and 2, which was learning outcomes and context. We've now talked about the other ones, which was tangible outcomes, focusing questions, and adult world connections. And the goal is, and then over the next roughly hour and a half, we want to get everything into a format that we can share for a project concept. Now, I don't expect that your number 1 and number 2 are locked in and solid and you're just going to do 3, 4, 5 and you're done, right? It never ends up working like that. You'll probably go to step 3, realize step 1 needs a little tweak, go back, tweak step 1, and organically kind of develop this concept over the next hour or so. And the work output you're expected to generate is going to be a Padlet. And so I'm going to share the link to this. And I'll actually share my screen when I navigate it really quick, just so everyone can see what it is. I'm going to paste the link in the general chat right now, but actually I'll do that after because I don't want to lose everybody when I do that. So sharing my tab. So by the end of this work time, you're going to post one of these little, they're called Padlets, and this is everyone can work in here at once. And so you will actually just add a little thing with a project title and some basic information. I have 2 exemplars here. One is an exemplar where I list all this information in the Padlet itself. And so I have the name of my project, the basic information. I also have each of these sections that are going to have a couple sentence description. You can also add links, images, things that help kind of round out what people will see. And the goal here is to put enough information that people are able to give you feedback, ask questions, and help you further develop your project. And so you might put it all in this Padlet, or you might just say the name, the basic details, and have a link to a Google Doc or some other format that you've used to do your planning. The only thing I ask is if you do a link, make sure that it's shared correctly and that people can actually get to it. And we will be spending time this afternoon going through, and everybody will read everybody's, trying to give really good feedback so we can all improve. And so I'm going to take this link, and I am now going to paste that into the general chat. You don't have to start writing in there yet. That's just where we need to get to by the end. And your goal now is to start rounding out all those elements of your project concept. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone has questions we can address as a group before we break back into work time. And you can also raise your hand and I can bring you up here to ask if that's easier. Okay, so then we're going to take about a solid hour. In this hour, we'll all be roaming around, helping however we can. I do really push you that there should be more time during this hour, heads down, kind of working, researching, typing, than there should be conversation. Obviously, there should be some coordination and bouncing ideas, but the majority of the time should be like heads down planning time. And then if you need anything specific, you can, of course, private message us. We'll come over and check in. And in about an hour, we'll do kind of a quick, how's everyone doing? And then we'll even have a little bit more work time. And we'll be kind of summarizing and starting our gallery walk around 2:45 your time. Alrighty, breaking into groups. Have fun.